Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of SISociety's Taboo Talks. This month, we're talking all things sexual violence and sexual assault, and we're joined today by Tracy DeTomasi. She's joining us now, representing Callisto. And you should just be able to send the invitation to join. Beautiful. And this is going to be a really deep, transformative conversation. Hello, Heather. Welcome.
Hi.
Yeah, this month's topic has been so interesting so far, just to have all these different perspectives and insights. And I'm sure that this conversation is going to provide, a whole new perspective that maybe a lot of us haven't really taken into consideration in these realms of sexual assault. So Tracy is joining us now. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're so honored to have you on Taboo Talks today with SISociety. And for anyone just joining for the first time, we're a global movement and that's really centered around exploring these taboo topics in a sacred and safe way. And SIS stands for sensuality, intimacy, and sexuality. So each month we have a new topic in one of those realms. And this month is all around sexual assault, sexual abuse, and how we can really move into these spaces with more awareness and compassion. And this week we're joined by Tracy DeTomasi.
DeTomasi. You were close.
DeTomasi.
Yes.
DeTomasi. Is this an Italian name?
It is. It is. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Italian too, so I was like, that sounds Italian.
Yes.
Beautiful. We have similar hair, kind of
I
like,
know. I know. Yeah.
look alike.
My grandparents were from Italy, so yep.
Amazing. Mine too. So Tracy is the CEO of Callisto, which she'll tell you a little bit more about, and is a licensed social worker for over 20 years and has extensive experience working in the field of gender-based violence with a deep understanding of the ecosystems of survivors, offenders, and allies. So welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you. Maybe if you just want to introduce yourself a little bit more and also what Callisto is and why you're here representing them.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm just so grateful to be here because I think that we just don't have these conversations enough. And so I appreciate you both for being here and for inviting me to join. Like you said, I've been working in the field of gender-based violence for over 20 years. I kind of got thrown into it by accident, but I've really enjoyed it. And as soon as I started, I realized just how important this conversation is and how many people are impacted by sexual violence. I actually started my career as a therapist for adolescent sex offenders. And so, unlike most victim advocates and survivor advocates, I really started with understanding the problem of sexual assault, which is the offender. And I think that that has changed, or at least reframed my point of view in a lot of this work a little bit differently than others, which I'm grateful for. But a little bit about Callisto. We are a US-based national nonprofit. And we build technology to help empower survivors. And so our technology, which is called Callisto Vault, simply put, and I can explain this more later in a bit if you'd like, but we work to match survivors of serial perpetrators. We are not a reporting tool. We are not a database of perpetrators, but what we really do is provide a way for survivors to confidentially find help and find out if their perpetrator has harmed anybody else. Working in this field for as long as I've had, the two things that I get told the most when I talk to a survivor is I thought I was alone, and if they've considered reporting or they worried about reporting or felt guilty for not reporting, they did it oftentimes because they wanted to make sure that that person didn't harm another person. And so with Callisto, we can connect those survivors for them to then make the decision of what they want to make. And it's very confidential. And we use technology that we create in-house that's highly encrypted to do so. And currently, anybody in the US over 18, the US and its territories that have access to a .edu account have access to Callisto Vault for free.
Mm. Incredible. This is so unique already. I'm just like so interested in this perspective because we always like, I feel like these narratives are always framed around the victims. And something that's really been on our heart is like seeing both sides of any situation. And oftentimes, I don't know what the statistics are, maybe you can share, Tracy, but oftentimes these perpetrators were victims first. And by looking at the root of why they are perpetrating in the first place, it leads you back to a place of more compassion and understanding, and we're able to treat the root cause, so we can hopefully avoid the victims from even experiencing the pain to begin with by treating the symptom, like, you know, the root of why they're even perpetrating to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. When I worked with offenders, I always got asked, like, why would you want to do that? And it was really to prevent sexual assault. You know, a majority of sexual assaults are committed by serial perpetrators. So on college campuses, the statistics are that 90% of sexual assaults on college campuses in the US are committed by serial perpetrators. And those perpetrators offend 6 times on average before leaving college. So that's just while they're in college. And from the work that I did, and again, my youngest client was 6, my oldest client was 22. And the average number of offenses was about 6 for each of them, whether or not anybody else knew about them, that was about what they admitted. And all of the clients that I worked with had also a significant history of their own sexual abuse. And so we can have empathy for an offender with also being able to hold them accountable to the crimes that they've committed as well, and not to forgive their behavior, because we need to make sure that we're holding perpetrators accountable. But part of that, to make sure that they don't do it again, is to understand why they did it so that we can prevent them. And, you know, it's been a long time since I've done that work, so I don't know what the research says now. But when I did the work about 20 years ago, with treatment, at least for adolescents, recidivism was as high as 15% and as low as 5%. So treatment was really, really effective. And so that's somewhat of while we're not doing treatment at Callisto and we're not actually working with the offenders, we don't actually know any of their names. What we do know is that if we empower survivors, there's more of a chance of them being held accountable. And therefore, we're interrupting that sexual assault cycle. And we're stopping the problem by holding the person accountable who's creating the problem. You know, we talk about the statistics on college campuses in the US are about 2.5 million college students are sexually assaulted every year. And a lot of times as victim advocates, we frame that as the problem. But that's not the problem. That's the symptom of the problem. The problem is perpetrators. That is the problem. And even going beyond that, the problem is really the culture that we live in and how those perpetrators get away with it, how they've manipulated the culture, how power has really impacted that, and the power that those offenders hold, whether societally or just within their community or over a victim. And those are things that have changed. They've changed significantly since Me Too, Me Too went viral, but we still have so much left to change.
Mm. Yeah, wow. Yeah, thank you for those statistics. They're really powerful. Like, just taking them in and breathing them in. It's really intense. And I imagine, Jared, I think you said 2.5 million college students really harassed or have some sort of sexual abuse every year, and that's just reported, correct? So that's like the reported number.
That's that's not necessarily reported to authorities. That's when surveyed, that victims identify that they've been sexually assaulted via surveys, so that they might not have reported. So that's all sexual assault. The number of reporting is less. I think it's less than 10% of students, actually, of anybody that actually reports to police or Title IX or to any of the systems in place. And again, my statistics are mostly US based.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really powerful. Yeah, I want to circle back to something that you shared before, how you spoke about reform and the work that you did with child sex offenders. Did you find that there was a common thread of as to why these individuals were doing what they did? Like, I imagine, like, what's coming through for me is some sort of trauma, but was there something specific that you noticed as a pattern across the board?
Yeah, again, it's been a long time, so I'm not going to quote any specific statistics as far as research goes, because it's been a long time since I've looked at that research pool. But most of the offenders have their own victimization, so they have experienced trauma, whether that's sexual. Most of the time, it's sexual trauma, but it can be physical trauma. So it can be physical abuse. It can be witnessing domestic violence. It can be extreme neglect. But the important thing to note, so I think that if it was, let's say it's 90% of survivors, it was around then, again, I don't know the exact statistic, but if 90% of offenders have experienced some kind of sexual harm, if not more than that. But that doesn't mean that if somebody is sexually harmed, that they go on to offend. That's just looking at the pool of offenders. So it doesn't mean that you are absolutely, if you've been offended as a child, particularly if you're a man, because 97% of perpetrators are men, cis men, it doesn't mean that you're going to go on to offend. It just means that there is a pool of victims that then go on to perpetrate sexual violence to others. And so that is definitely a catalyst. But that's not the only one. There's a lot of environmental factors. There's a lot of cultural factors. There's a lot of, how can you get away with it? There's actually studies that, oh gosh, I wish I knew the statistics right off the top of my head. But there were studies done for college age men, and they asked a question about, if you could get away with rape, would you rape? And I don't know if they asked it that bluntly, but when asked, a huge percentage said they would, if they weren't held accountable, if nobody would know. And the thing is that 99% of perpetrators are never held accountable at all. So they are getting away with it. And that's because our culture accepts so much leniency towards sexual violence. And I think, one of the big things is that we don't know what sexual violence is. Because even using the term sexual violence, sexual assault, it implies that there is some kind of struggle. And so often with sexual assault, there's not a struggle at all. There is, the victim freezes. And so it looks like they're not engaged. It looks like you're having sex. It looks like a lot of different things, because when we think about rape, when we think about sexual assault, we think about this man coming from behind the bushes or in a parking garage. And that's not really what happens. And I should say, I think we should have probably said this at the beginning if you didn't, but we should put a trigger warning around this conversation, just because we are talking about some really difficult stuff. And I won't get too graphic, but with that, I do think that the image of what people think rape is and what think sexual assault is and what it actually is can be very, very different. And so people don't even know that they've been sexually assaulted. There's another study that talks about women on college campuses and how they will identify that they have basically experienced the legal definition of rape. But then that same group of women, only 75% of them will say that it's rape, because they see that, yes, I did not consent, or I was too incapacitated to consent. But then when asked, were you raped? They say no, because they don't identify it as such. And so a lot of the times it's the language, it's the culture, it's how we frame these issues that we need to continually evolve, which is, again, why I'm just so grateful to be here and for the work that you all are doing.
Wow. I'm sorry, there's a little bit noise in the background where I am, but I just wanted to ask, like, how would you explain, how would you define to someone listening if they have been sexually assaulted? What does sexual assault or sexual abuse actually feel like or look like then for most people?
Yeah, I think that a lot of times people freeze. You know, back in the US, the laws until the 80s said that you had to fight against your attacker in order for it to be considered rape. But in reality, that's not the case. Trauma responses are fight, flight, freeze, and appease, or fawn, it's sometimes called. And so sometimes it looks like flirting. Sometimes it looks like trying to make sure that the perpetrator's not harming you more and being on their side and being empathetic just to get yourself safe where you can get out of the room. Sometimes it is with a significant other where you're just kind of sick of saying no and you give in. And I think that we also have this very black and white definition of what it is. In the criminal system, it can be black and white, but in reality, there's a lot of levels of violation. And so if you didn't consent to something, it is sexual assault, whether that's physical touch or not. It could be somebody sending you a dick pic and you didn't consent to that. That is some level of sexual violation and sexual violence. If that's something that you didn't want, or sharing images, it can be all of that, because that can just be as harmful psychologically and emotionally to the victim. And there's a spectrum of responses for victims. Some people don't have any PTSD after they've been raped because they got the help, they got the support, they got the mental health needs. They had a caring community, people believed them. And then other people have severe PTSD because they were blamed. People didn't believe them, they had to hide it. The perpetrator continually abused them. And so it's just a wide range. And so it's kind of hard to answer your question of what does it look like? Because it's going to look so different for so many people. And I think the important thing for if people are wondering if they've been sexually assaulted or not, is that there's a level of violation, and maybe you have. And if you didn't consent to something, that's all you need to know. And that might not have reached the legal definition of sexual assault as well. The legal definitions of sexual assault are very different, and vary from state to state. In the US, they vary from country to country, everywhere else. And they're not always the greatest laws. They haven't evolved enough. They're based on really archaic, patriarchal, white supremacy type of definitions, and they've evolved a little bit, but they haven't evolved enough.
Yeah, thanks for answering that question. Sorry, Heather. I just wanted to say what I'm hearing from your definition is, honestly, it feels all encompassing. It feels like all of us have experienced some level of sexual assault and some sort of trauma from these experiences. And yeah, it's like something that's really, it's hard to kind of like pin down and maybe put in like a one definition because it is so broad. What were you going to say, Heather, though?
Oh, I mean, but what was coming through around the concept of consent from your definition, because I hear consent, and I'm wondering if consent for you is just verbal, if consent can take another shape and form. Is there a specific law? I know every state differs, like you said, but are there specific laws around consent and what it looks like, and how can we assert really clear consent in spaces where we're...
Yeah, I think that there are different laws around consent, and it also depends on if you're talking about, sexual harassment in the workplace is going to be different than a stranger or something else entirely. And again, we think of a lot of these situations in black and white, and it's not, because maybe you consented to oral sex, but you didn't consent to vaginal penetration or anal penetration. And so you consented to one thing, but not the other, or you consented to making out, but you didn't consent to having sex. And so I think that There's some states, I think California passed a law years ago that it's not just the absence of no, where in the past, and still some laws say that you have had to verbally say no.
Mm-hmm.
But other states say that you have to have a yes, and you have to verbally say yes. But that gets really tricky in the heat of the moment. And especially with all of the stigma and shame around sex in general, even positive, healthy sex can be difficult to have that happen. And so my rule of thumb is get enthusiastic consent. Make sure that your partner's whole mind, body, spirit are in it. And that makes sex better, first of all. It just makes sex so much better. And then two, you'll know that you have consent. You know, when I was growing up and sex ed and all of that, it was like, oh, you don't want to ask for consent, it'll ruin the mood. You can make consent super sexy if you want to, you know, like, and you absolutely should. And it will make sex better because then you can figure out exactly what your partner wants and exactly what your partner doesn't want. So you make sure that you don't cross the line. And we are all responsible for that, because I'm sure that we've all violated somebody in some capacity, and it doesn't mean that we have violated them into the point that we're all rapists, but that we could all do better at making sure that our partners are really enthusiastic about what we're doing, and making sure that we don't violate anybody. And I would much rather be on the side of making absolute sure I have consent than thinking, well, maybe I do, but I'm not sure, but I'm going to keep going forward. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's kind of what we've been. And with that, I think the culture needs to change. You know, one of my colleagues and I were talking last week about the song that comes on this time of year that's so controversial is "Baby, It's Cold Outside,"
We're
right?
gonna.
So it sounds now like the date rape song, and it still gets played, and people are like, but it's an old song and everybody should play it. Actually, when that song was released, was about female empowerment to have sex,
Hmm.
because in the 30s or 1930s or 40s, whenever it was written, it was that women couldn't have sex outside of marriage. So the only way that they could go, oh yes, I want to stay the night at your house and have sex with you, was to go, well, maybe I can't. And it was a joke. And it was like, during that time, so what's in this drink was meant to be like, oh, haha, I'm not going to be blamed for being able to have sex, because women didn't have control over their own bodies then. And now, when you can look at the culture shift, which is why it's so important to shift the culture, where now it's like that song is horrific, and absolutely horrific. And my opinion is that it shouldn't be played anymore, because it doesn't pass the age of time. But it's really interesting to think about how that's changed, and how playing hard to get has been a part of this. You know, I've talked to a lot of men of like, well, what do I do if a woman's playing hard to get, or this other person's playing hard to get? And I know I'm talking a lot in heteronormative language, but it's like, if she's playing hard to get, then don't get her. Just stop. You don't want somebody that's playing hard to get. You want somebody that's enthusiastic and can communicate with you. And the work that you all are doing on sex positivity is so important to all of that. And it just hasn't made it to everywhere in the world yet, or everywhere in the US for that matter.
Yeah, somebody just, this is so interesting, even the talk around that song, because I've had a lot of friends that have been like, wait, like when I was young, this song was just normal, and now I'm actually listening to the lyrics and it's like cringing. It's
Mm-hmm.
cringy, and like how much of this is in our media, is in our culture, is in movies, is in music, right? And it's just so normalized. And someone messaged in the beginning of this video and was asking, how can we stop sexual violence in the Middle East? And I have to think that the Middle East is one of the most dramatic places that sexual violence is still very much normalized, where women really are less equal to like half the amount as men are. That's how they're viewed. And so I'm curious to hear, like, yeah, what you know about the laws in different, not just in different states, but different countries of the world, and
Yeah,
how we can, yeah, and how we can really start to take steps towards reforming these laws.
I can't really speak to anything specific in the Middle East. However, what I can say is that ending sexual assault in the Middle East is likely going to be the same as ending it anywhere. And that is understanding trauma, understanding the responses to trauma, understanding what sexual assault looks like, and being able to have conversations about sex with your clothes on before you have conversations about sex with your clothes off. Because that's something that we're just not doing. And we have to get, this is why it's like such a great taboo talk, because sex is taboo. It is meant to be shameful. There's so many religions that shame sex. I mean, most of them do. And so I think that we need to talk about that shame and talk about how to see sex in a different way, which is really complicated with different cultures. And it's not just the Middle East. It's with and it's not just religion, although religion tends to dictate a lot of that in all cultures at some level. And so I think that if we can start to really bring awareness, and start to talk about that culture that protects, um, protects rape culture, protects offenders, deal with the power dynamics. So often sexual assault, particularly when you have more of the predators, it's about power and control. It's not about sex at all. It's about dominating power, and which is why, religion, there's a sense of power there. There's a sense of trust. That's why priests can get away with raping so many boys and sexually abusing so many boys in the Catholic Church. But it's not just the Catholic Church. It's every religion has their own quote unquote scandals. And so I think it's also about talking about toxic masculinity and the pressures that we put on men to have sex, to quote unquote be players. I'm using like all these terrible words to describe this because they should be archaic. But I think that we need to talk about the mental health of men. Because when men are traumatized, I mean, 1 in 6 boys experience a sexual assault by the time they're 18. And what do they do with that? As women, we are talking about it more. We're teaching our younger generations about it more. We haven't talked about that. Men are not talking about it because of homophobia, because of stigma, because men are supposed to love sex and have sex all the time. And again, I'm speaking in sarcasm and in quotes. But until we start to address that, we're not going to be able to address the mental health of boys. And then when that becomes a problem is when they go on to offend. And so I think that talking about the trauma of young boys will help solve sexual assault and make sex better, like sex positivity better. So yeah, I feel like I'm off on a tangent, so I'm going to stop there.
It's a really good tangent. I'm right there with you. Like the collective narrative around masculinity and the fact that what I feel and have experienced that they haven't had a safe space to really express their feelings, and that's causing this repression, this resistance, this shame. And that dense feeling of shame can manifest in so many ways, such as sexual abuse, because everything requires a space to be seen and heard, and everything requires an outlet. And I hear what you're saying right now is the importance of creating and cultivating safe spaces for young boys and for the men in our lives to be able to express. And like, that feels like a potential seed of a solution for this really global issue. And that
Yeah.
feels like, okay, like this is something tangible that we can work on. Because sometimes when you look at something as large as this, as global sexual abuse, it can feel so overwhelming, and you're like, how do we fix this? What do we do? What are the solutions? Where do we head? But I'm just so grateful that this came through in this conversation, because for those of you listening or right now or rewatching, like, this is a tangible solution, and getting to the root of it, getting to the root of this trauma. So yeah, thank you. I'm so grateful today. Like you're sharing so much valuable insight and compassion, and you're just merging so many different dimensions together in a way that's really digestible. So I'm very grateful for you and the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. And you're welcome.
Yeah, this conversation is just wow, it's so important to have, and the men really, really do need spaces where they can express themselves. They can express their vulnerabilities. They can express their fears. I feel like for so long, women have had these circles and these. It's just more appropriate for women to cry, right, in our media, in our culture. More appropriate for women to share when they're feeling, I don't know, just any sort of emotion. Um, and yeah, and it just goes to show how connected our emotional bodies and our physical bodies are. And when our emotional bodies aren't being properly cared for, it manifests in the physical and manifests negatively and affects us in all these other ways. And truly, we're here to take care of each other, because if the women aren't creating these safe spaces for the men, then guess what's happening? The women are actually the ones that are now getting hurt by these men who don't feel safe. And so it just goes to show that we're really also connected, and that we really need each other to heal. And the solution isn't in continuing to separate the genders, because we're all one. You know, we're all one in just these different bodies, these different meat sacks, and and when we can just come back to this true oneness and compassion and holding so much understanding for each other, I feel that that the solutions will naturally and organically fall into place, because the men will feel safe to soften and surrender, and the women will feel empowered to nurture and to open up and feel safe with the men in return. So
And men need to start to create that space for themselves too.
mm,
You know, I think it's really important when men see other men do it, because, you know,
mm-hmm,
right now, traditionally speaking, again, in heteronormative language and with straight couples, men rely on women for that softness, but then they're not calling out other men and they're not being soft with other men. And so we can't do that for them. If we could have solved violence against women as women, we would have solved this so long ago. But we need men in the conversation. We need men to call out other men. And we need men to create their own safe spaces. You know, we've created our safe spaces, and they need to for them too, because, you know, a lot of times one of the questions that we get is like, oh, what about false reporting? What about false reporting? And men on college campuses are more likely to be sexually assaulted while they're in college than they are to be accused of false report. Yet so many people worried about the harm of false reporting, yet they're not worried about the harm of men being sexually assaulted. And it might look different. You know, hazing is such a terrible culture within sports and within fraternities. And a lot of that hazing is sexual in nature, but they're not considering having to stand naked in front of a bunch of other men and getting a slap on the ass as sexual violence. But that can be. And that's like and I always hate to like kind of rate sexual violence, because it's whatever it is to you, how awful and traumatic that can be. But, you know, a slap on the ass is way different than penetration too, you know, and penetration happens with objects, with body parts, with everything. And it's just normalized by a sense of hazing and initiation into a club of brothers, whether that's on a football team or into a fraternity. And again, I'm not saying that all fraternities are like that, or all people in fraternities are like that, but I think that there are problems, like that does happen, and there are problems in that.
yeah, what you're sharing now is actually reminding me of when I was in college. I went to a really big university, and I remember hearing this story walking past one of the fraternity buildings, and there's all these like tally marks like on the side of the building, and I was kind of like, what's that about? And they're like, oh yeah, that's like the number of women that each of these men have like sexually assaulted, like taken basically. And it's like a sense of pride. And again, I don't want to just on all fraternities, because there's so many heart-centered beautiful fraternities as well, but it really is something that uh, yeah, like these men's groups really need their own reforming, like you said, and it starts from within before we can even merge with them. They need to be doing their own work too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for bringing
Absolutely.
that to light. So moving into like we were talking kind of like how we can prevent these things from happening, but you know, these things have happened and they will continue to happen. So also on the other end, in treatment, how do we really help? How do we treat these? Um, I'm really curious, like, how do we help the perpetrators? Like, once they've been perpetrating, like, what is the best treatment for them so they can stop doing that?
Yeah, I think that there's a variety of treatments out there. Again, I haven't really researched like what the newest, most evidence-based is, but there's a lot of group work that happens. There's a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy that happens for offenders, but it really boils down, in my opinion, to accountability. Like you can't have treatment without accountability. And so for anybody who's listening to this, of like, throw all of the offenders in the garbage, and I'm trying my hardest not to swear, but like we shouldn't care about them at all. Well, the reason that we should care is, again, for them to stop offending. So we're preventing assaults before they even happen, because they probably will offend. And you can have accountability and treatment at the same time. And you cannot have treatment without accountability. And so I think a lot of people think like, oh, we're being light on them if we're just treating them. Treating these issues can sometimes be way more like difficult and complicated than just locking somebody up. But locking people up is also potentially an answer. But there has to be accountability, and that's the first step, because a lot of times offenders use what Jennifer Freed in the 90s coined DARVO, and it's an acronym for what offenders do to not be held accountable, and that's deny. Oh my goodness, of course, I'm going to forget the acronym now. I'm missing what the A is right now, but then reverse victim offender. And basically we see this all the time. Somebody's accused, and you're like, no, 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 I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. And then they get away with it. We're like, oh, right, of course this person couldn't have done it. They're such a great person. And then the next thing that they do, they attack. A is attack. I knew I would get there eventually. And so then they attack and say, you're falsely accusing me. It's this, but they were too drunk. They were a slut. They were asking for it. What else did they expect? They invited me up into their house. Like, you go through all those really big victim blaming things. And then it becomes like, oh, I was the one that is hurt. This is hurting me that you're falsely accusing me. And now I'm the victim in this whole thing. And you can see that with so many of them. And so part of it is holding them accountable, acknowledging all those things, acknowledging the cognitive distortions that they're putting in place in order to really get through that DARVO, and then making sure that they have responsibility for each part of that. How did you hurt the victim? What did you do? How did you blame the victim? How did you use the culture to support your belief? There's so much of this of cognitive distortions, and there's a really great bit by Hannah Gadsby, who is a Australian comedian, and she did an event about the height, like in 2018, 2017, in the height of the Me Too movement, at an award show. And she talks about how men draw the line of being a good man wherever their line is. So they draw the line in the sand, and they're always in the good men section. And so what really needs to happen, and again, you should watch the clip, because I'm not going to be able to get all the nuance to it, but really it's women and non-binary folks who need to be controlling that line. It's not the men that should be controlling whether or not they're a good guy or not. Because the thing is that all rapists do some good things. Most of the things that they probably do are good. We want to make offenders as good people or bad people or evil people or not evil people, but really when it comes down to it, they're both. And so good people can do really horrendous things. Like Harvey Weinstein did a ton of amazing things for amazing people and made beautiful movies. And he aggressively, violently raped numerous hundreds and hundreds of women. And the same with Bill Cosby. You know, Bill Cosby did so much for Black people in Hollywood. So much. And he also raped hundreds of women. And so I think that we need, like, to help offenders, we as a society need to get away from what does an offender look like? Because I think that we all know that we know a survivor. Post Me Too, we all know that somebody, at least one person, if not a huge amount of people in our life, is a survivor. What we don't often think about is, who are the offenders in our life? We all know offenders too, but we don't talk about that. And you know, we don't, well, they're not this, they're not a rapist. They just did this bad thing, but they're not a rapist, you know? And I think that that is something that we need to really address as a society of, what does a rapist look like? They look like a priest. They look like a pastor. They look like a coach. They look like the favorite USA gymnastic doctor that's really sweet and kind. And a lot of the girls who he was assaulting also really loved him. They look like everybody, you know, they can be anybody. And I think that that's just a really important thing. And why we talk about believing survivors is because when you hear, my friend is a perpetrator, you got to think, how can that happen? I know this person. I love this person. People I love don't rape other people, don't sexually assault other people. So your mind automatically goes to a cognitive distortion about, well, then what did this other person do to make him, again, I'm going to use him in this, make him assault her or make him assault him? Like, what did he do? Because he couldn't have just done this on his own. And that's where we get to the victim blaming. Well, what was she wearing? How much did she have to drink? Was she asking for it? All the things. And that's what we really need to stop. So again, another tangent that I kind of got away from the original question. But there's just so many things that we need to do. And until we change the culture, it's going to be so incredibly difficult to hold offenders accountable individually. And that's why when people like Harvey Weinstein are caught, they said, well, we could do that back in the day. The culture was different then. And if you look at going back to Baby It's Cold Outside, the culture was different. Because what's the difference of what's in that drink of if I put something in somebody's drink, or it's a little tongue in cheek and she's asking for it? Because sometimes in that case, she was actually asking for it. She wanted to have sex. And in other times it was, I don't want to have sex and you're just drugging me. And how do you make the difference? Well, we're always going to side on the fact that makes us good men. So hopefully I didn't get too ranty there and that still tracked.
No, that was marvelous. I feel like, yeah, what's coming through for me right now is you shared so much and I'm just digesting it now, but the concept of these men's identities can be wrapped so tightly, like this concept of a good man, right? Like, I'm a good man, I would never do something like that. How do we as individuals address these things with people? Because it's such a sensitive subject, right? Like, when you see something in the act, when someone shares something with you, like, do you have any advice for people that maybe have sexual abuse or someone crossing a line, and how they can manage that? Like, what's the best way to address
I mean, as with everything I said, that there's a spectrum. So this next thing I'm going to say might not work for what your situation is, but I think we've really talked a lot about calling people out on their behaviors. I think what we need to start doing is calling people in. And what I mean by that is, hey, you know, instead of saying, don't do that, well, I don't even know what I did. Instead saying, you know, I saw you do this thing. Did you recognize that that was problematic? And can we talk about why that's problematic? And then it also requires the other person to have some kind of understanding of, there's a defensive there. No, I'm not problematic. I didn't do any of these things. And it's being willing to say, oh, okay, I can have a problematic behavior without being a bad person. because I think that we get defensive and, we're always triggering somebody's trauma in those difficult conversations. It's as soon as I get defensive, I'm not listening. We talk about how like the brain triggers where part of trauma is that you flip your lid, which means you stop processing from the human part of our brain in that frontal cortex, because you're going into more of that reptilian brain of that automatic fight, flight, freeze, fawn kind of response. And so you're not fully processing all of it until the adrenaline goes down, until all of those hormones goes down, the cortisol, all of that's gotten you hyped up and ready to act. When all of those go down, then you can start actually thinking about it. But sometimes when you say something to somebody of like, hey, that was problematic, their lid flips for a different reason. And they're not thinking either. And they're just like, no, I have to defend. And I've got to convince you why I'm such a good person. But the more that we can call people in, and not all behaviors deserve to be called in, not at all. But some of those things, when we're really good friends with them and we've built relationships with people, to be able to educate, because there's, as I said before, there's a spectrum of behaviors. So, and really figuring out where that person can be on that spectrum. And so if kind of meet them where it's at, as long as they're not, and it's so hard because if they're harming somebody, it's a whole different game. That's why I'm a little hesitant to say just hesitant in this conversation, because I think a lot of it can be taken out of context, but there's such a spectrum. And if you can say, let me teach you why that's different now. I've been in this field for 25 years, almost 25 years. And there's things that I used to say that I'm like, oh, I can't say that anymore. All right, that's off the list. Nope, can't say that. I can't make that joke anymore. And sometimes I have to grieve the fact that I can't make that joke. I used to love a good she said joke. And now I'm like, absolutely not. I can't, those just aren't funny to me anymore. And so it is grieving some of that old language, grieving the culture shift, and really just allowing each other to evolve and make mistakes and have grace and accountability. Accountability is that, yes, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, and I'm not going to do it again. But you have to have the behavior change piece in order to, it's not just the apology. The apology can be really important, but it's also behavior change. But you can't change your behavior if you don't understand why something's problematic.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like
calling people in and calling people. Sorry.
Okay.
Another term that I like to use is like calling people in and calling people up. Like, how can we support each other to rise? And from just this conversation, I'm realizing like not only have basically all of us been the victims of some sort of sexual overstepping or assault, but probably most of us have also been perpetrators and maybe not even realized when we were overstepping someone else's consensual boundaries and we weren't receiving a full fuck yes. Like, something that Heather and I like to say is, if it's not a full fuck yes, it's a full fuck no. And so how
Absolutely.
many of us haven't received a full fuck yes, and we've maybe unconsciously been the perpetrators, and somebody didn't say anything to us, and then we continue in that behavior. And women can do that in lots of ways with men too, with different sort of dominating kinks and all sorts of things. And of course, kinking and consensual and is a whole different topic. But all I'm saying is that it's really important to my train of thought is like, it's really important to bring these things to the conversation, and to our conscious awareness. And especially if we've been receiving that, like maybe we've been in a relationship where we've been taken advantage of and have our boundaries crossed over again and again and again for years, or had a parent who did that to us. Maybe we just inherently think that's normal, and we just think that's how all sexual interactions are. So we're continuing to perpetuate that same action and behavior in our relationships, our friendships, and we don't even know that it's making people feel uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
So like, I really appreciate that sentiment and how important it is that we share this in a loving and kind way.
Yeah, if we're just reprimanding someone, not actually educating them, and you know, at the beginning of these, you're just like, hey, you're wrong. You did something wrong. In my whole life, I had no contact. Like, what do you mean I'm wrong? So it, like, what's coming through for me right now is the importance of, like, calling someone to rise, like you were saying, Alfina, and really saying, like, hey, like, are you aware that you do here doesn't feel good? It didn't feel good for me, and it might not feel good for other people. And like, really, and this obviously feels like it's kind of under the umbrella of a light offense, or like something that we're seeing that isn't like so severe in the violence realm. But it just it completely like reframes the space of like, you're good, you're bad, like what you were saying, Tracy, and moves it to the space of like, hey, I care about you. Or are you cognizant and conscious of the fact that you're doing this, and I'm speaking into this because I love you, and I want to address this now, like, and I feel like it's up to us to really courageously step into those spaces and have those conversations despite them stirring comfort.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I have a question for you, Tracy. We have like 7 minutes left or so. But in speaking of like ideal sexual liberation, sexual reformation, what would an ideal clause or agreement in like legal systems look like that would be protective of everyone and their autonomy and their sexual expression? Like what would that look like? What kinds of laws
Mm.
need to be written?
I don't even know, because I think that we have so much work to do, but I think the laws need to be trauma informed. I think that they need to fully understand how trauma works. Again, as I mentioned earlier, um, a lot of laws were written for basically old rape myths of it was only rape if you fought back, and if you didn't fight back, then it wasn't considered rape. But really, we know now that most people freeze if they're being raped. And so how does that account for it? And so looking through a trauma informed lens would say, how do people react when they're being traumatized and when they're being attacked? And let's start there. And let's get some protections for not allowing victim blaming. I'm sure, I don't know if you're aware of Denim Day. It happens every April, and it started in Italy. And it happened because there's a huge case that you can look up about it. But basically, a judge in Italy said that it wasn't rape because she had on really tight jeans, and how could he have gotten her jeans off if they were so tight? And so then they started this movement in the 90s it's actually gotten more traction recently, called Denim Day, to bring awareness to that, and to somehow stopping how victims are blamed when they do report, because reporting to police and going through the court process is very, very traumatizing. So whatever the laws that we create need to really consider not only the laws of what's considered sexual assault and what's not, but how do we try those in a way that's also, that's fair, that is fair for the accused. Like, we have to be fair to the accused too, because while false reports are rare, they still happen, and we want to make sure that is addressed, because most of the time false reports, at least in the US, are against Black men. And so we need to understand the inherent racism in all of our systems too. But I think that starting with understanding what's a fair process and what's not working in the system, and how victims are being put on trial. And there's a documentary on Netflix right now called Victim Suspect, and it shows how often that victims go to report a sexual assault, and then by the time they leave the police station, they're being arrested for false accusations when the police never investigated the crime that they reported. And so even before we get into changing a huge amount of laws, it's really just about training police officers and training judges to understand trauma and to understand the impacts of it. Because I think that's really probably the next step, of what we need to do, because Me Too brought so much awareness to this issue, and now it's quieted, right? But we need another wave, and I'm hopeful that another wave will really hit and awaken the consciousness to the next level of things that are happening.
Yeah, it sounds like the through line of everything is compassion, you know, and understanding the process, especially speaking like in the process of reporting. Like I've moved through a space like that, and it was so sterile and so cold, and like I felt like they didn't believe me, and I was like, I just felt crazy being there. Like I actually didn't end up reporting the specific incident because I just felt like so invalidated through the process, and I was like, this is a problem. Like if I'm experiencing, people are experiencing this, and it's the conversation that I'm having starts now with us. So yeah, I'm so grateful to.
So many people think the reporting process is like an episode of Law and Order SVU. That you have the police on your side, that they have really great systems, that everything's connected, that they've got somebody that they can call and they can type into a million screen computer and get all the information that they need in 5 seconds, and that you get justice every time. And that is not the case. Rape kits sit on shelves for decades. They're not tested. They're thrown away. They're not, a lot of times, like I live in Nashville, and up until several years ago, you could only get a rape kit done at one hospital in the entire city, which has changed now, but I don't think every hospital that you go to, you can get a rape kit done. And nobody thinks about that. You don't think about asking where I can get a rape kit done. You just know to go to the hospital, or you just know to go to the police. And so there's just so many angles that we need to continue to tackle that. And I think that that's why with Callisto, we're trying a new tactic, and we're using, what we know about the system, and that is they don't connect survivors. And so we're really working on connecting survivors. So survivors, they have a voice. Survivors have always had a voice, but we're trying to get more people to listen to those survivor voices by connecting them, by amplifying them, by giving them the information that they need, whether or not they report, and really just putting that control back in the hands of survivors. And that's really what we're trying to do.
Yeah, this is incredible. And we have like only a couple minutes left before it's going to close this out. So I'd love for you to just share with anyone listening how they can connect with you further, how they can connect on Callisto, and yeah, get the help and the connection that they're looking for.
Yeah, you can either DM me, or please follow Callisto at Callisto on Instagram, Callisto. You can go to our website at projectcallisto.org. If you have a .edu account, you can register for our platform to enter into matching at callistovault.org. But we would love to have your support. You can donate to us because we are a nonprofit that's 100% philanthropically funded, and we are, we always love, whether you have $1 or $10 or $10,000, to really help make sure that we can move the needle and to connect as many survivors as possible. And we are looking to expand beyond college campuses eventually. And so any support that we have from your listeners, we would appreciate that. And if you're on a college campus and you want to get involved, there's a toolkit that we have on our website to be able to print out brochures and whatnot. And so, but feel free to reach out to me directly. Appreciate it.
This is amazing. And I'll be linking all of these in the bios as well. And just thank you again, Tracy, this conversation. It's activating so much in me. Like Heather was saying, I feel like I have a lot to digest, but it's been incredible. I feel like we could talk for hours. Yeah. And for anyone just joining now or at the end of this conversation, we've just been talking all around social reformation around these topics in sexual assault, and really how we can treat the perpetrators and help the perpetrators from continuing the assault and continuing the cycle. And so feel free to watch this whole episode over again to get all of this good information, and please share with anyone that you find would gain value from this conversation as well. Thank you both for joining.
Can I say one final note?
Yeah, of course.
Just if you are a survivor, even if you're not, but you've listened to this whole episode, make sure to ground yourself and center. Call a hotline if needed. Take some deep breaths. Really recenter yourself. This can be a really triggering conversation. And call your therapist. Do whatever you need to really center yourself after this, because this can be a lot. But thank you so much for letting me join.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has
So
been
grateful
amazing.
that Callisto exists and for the work you do, and
Hmm.
a lot of love, compassion. See you all very soon.
Thank you.
Hmm.